anyway, to begin, as I said, we always start with the hardest stuff first, and we're going to start with the physical kinds of things that happen when people are dying. And the important thing to remember about the physical parts of dying is that there is a body logic to it. That sometimes we think that the body is pretty serendipitous and it just kind of behaves in its own kind of willfulness. But there actually is a process that is logical, based on how the body, if you will, thinks. Is that the body has run from the minute you were born on a system called homeostasis, which means trying to achieve a steady state, trying to keep things as they are, try to keep things without too much fluctuation. If you're thinking about the process of dying, you need to think that there is a homeostasis process going on here. Because what happens as people experience a life-threatening illness is this homeostasis is always threatened. And so what the body tries to do is to circumvent it. So if the body senses that there is something horrible happening, the body says, this is a crisis, we're going to mobilize. We're going to send the blood to the only parts of the body that really count. And we're going to shunt the blood from the parts that aren't important. Okay? So what the body says, that the most crucial body parts are the brain, the heart, the lungs, and the kidneys. So the body says those are the parts of the body we're going to send blood to. The blood then does not go to the skeletal muscles. It doesn't go to the feet and the legs. It doesn't go to the gut. It doesn't go to the esophagus. Okay? So when you think about that, when you think about the body logic then, it makes a lot of sense when you think about what people look like as they're approaching dying. Because what happens when people become near death, they stop taking food and fluids. Okay? They don't take fluids, they don't take food, principally because, number one, they can't swallow because the skeletal muscle isn't getting any blood in the esophagus. They can't tolerate fluid and food in their gut because there's not enough blood going there to digest the food. So it's very logical, it makes a lot of sense from a body standpoint. The problem is, it doesn't make sense to those of us that are healthy. It's very, very hard. And the reason we talk about this so much is because we think that caring about someone means the minimum of care is giving food and fluids. But it's very important for us to remember that if someone is dying, pushing food and fluids actually may be causing more harm than doing good because of this body logic. The other thing that happens is that people get very cold. And again, if their skeletal muscle is not getting the blood, that's why they're going to be cold. Their legs will be cold, their feet will be cold, their hands may be cold. Often people are interesting too. One hand will be warm, one hand will be cold. Their feet will be warm, their hands will be cold. It really kind of depends on a lot of different parts of the physiology. It could be that the vessels are better in one foot or the other. It could be because there's some arteriosclerosis going on, and so there's some pooling in one way or another. There's lots of variations here, and so I'm offering this more as a generalized understanding, because every time I talk about this, someone says, well, when my relative was dying, that didn't happen. So this is a generalized kind of discussion. But these are the kinds of things that often arise. Other things that happen as people get closer and closer to the end of their life is that they start to have differences in their breathing. Even though the lungs are a crucial part of your existence and your body shunts the blood to the lungs, you're still going to have some changes. Very often people start breathing in a very shallow way. Again, it's an energy conservation kind of thing. That as the body is slowing down, the body is also saying we need to conserve our energy as much as possible. Try to make as much out of one effort as we can, trying not to expend any additional energy that we don't have to. So instead of taking a real deep breath and ventilating their entire lungs, they may breathe from very, very shallow, just the very top of their lungs. Their heart may also beat very erratically, or it can be beating with a very gentle kind of compression. Instead of beating like a healthy heart does this way, it may beat with less strength. So So if you feel for a pulse, you may feel something that's very thready or very, very faint. That's very normal, very normal. And again, even though the blood is sent to the brain, you may have some neurological changes. Again, because of the less strength of the compression of the heart, the blood doesn't get to the brain as well. It just doesn't flow there as well. And so what happens is the brain isn't oxygenated with the same kind of speed that it usually is. So there may be some neurological changes. The most common neurological change that you see is a change in the breathing, is that the brain stimulates the breath process. So if you have a neurological change, it will also change the pattern of the breathing. And that pattern change is often called Cheyne-Stokes breathing or apneic breathing. That's spelled A-P-N-E-A. And Cheyne-Stokes is C-H-E-Y-N-E-S-T-O-K-E-S. And this is a real classic pattern of breathing that is a breath pattern where people breathe really, really quickly, like 5 or 6 quick breaths, and then will stop breathing for anywhere from 20 seconds to 30 seconds, or even longer. So it's ha, 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 and then no breath for a period of time. This kind of breathing can be really difficult to watch, really difficult to watch. If you breathed with that person, which a lot of caregivers do, is that when someone is dying, it's very natural to sit at their bedside and want to hold their hand. And it's very common for people to just take on the breath rate of someone who is in that position. If you take on the breath rate of someone who's doing this apneic breathing, what you'll feel is pain in your chest. And that can be really distressing for the person who's sitting there, because you're saying to yourself, if this hurts me, it must hurt them. What can we do about that? Well, they've done studies and they said it doesn't hurt the person who's experiencing this, but I'd like to know how they found that out. I really would love to know how the research figured that one out. I think we have to assume that there probably is pain with that. How much is actually registered, we don't know. So I think, in my perception, we need to take a look at giving pain medicine based on what our best guess is. Is that Chodron and I have talked about this a whole lot, of how do you medicate people who are dying, because there are a lot of concerns with it. But I do think that we need to make sure that a person stays as comfortable as they possibly can, but not to over-medicate them so that they're completely clouded. But it is a spiritual process as you're approaching death, and you don't want to go in a drugged state. But in the same sense, if you're in tremendous pain, that's going to block you just as much as pain medicine is. Is that pain is not a spiritual process, in my opinion. We may argue about that later, I don't know. But it's a blockage in my mind to your spiritual practice. So if you have someone who is experiencing dying, is in a process of dying, my sense is that you need to try to quiet your own mind as much as you possibly can, sit with that person as quietly as you can, and try to sense at as deep a level as possible what that person might need. Do they need more pain medicine? Do they need to be turned? Does their head of bed need to be up in some way? There's many ways to increase the comfort at that point, but I think that's something that we need to recognize and honor in one way or another.
So I thought what I'd do is talk a little bit about the stages of death from the viewpoint of Tantric Buddhism. Lee talked about it from the physiological thing, what's going on with the body. In Buddhism, and particularly the Tantric tradition as practiced in Tibet, there's a whole schema and a whole description of what happens at death time. And the reason that this exists is because part of the practice is transforming death into a time of gaining spiritual realizations. So in order to transform something, you have to know what's going on during it so that you can meditate in a transformative way. So they have it all kind of laid out. But as Lee said, in describing the physiological things, it's not that it happens the same way for everybody, and it's not that when, you go through the 8 stages as described in the Tantric system, that you go through one and that's finished, and now we go on to the other, and it's all discrete little steps, with little markers in between so we know exactly where somebody is. It's not like that. Things happen quite differently for different people, depending upon what's the state of their body, what the reason for death is, and so on. In describing this, they correlate the stages of death with the different elements, earth, water, fire, air, and space. These elements being more like different characteristics of how the body functions. Earth being the kind of weighty thing. Water talking about, the fluid aspect of the body, adaptability. Fire, you're going into the digestive system. Breath, you're talking about movement, and so on. And that's also correlated not only with the 5 physical elements, but what we call the 5 aggregates of our psychophysical existence. So we have the form aggregate, referring to our body, and then the feeling, which is one aspect of our mind, the part of the mind that feels pain and pleasure. Discrimination, which is part of the mind that is able to identify objects and discriminate them. Compositional factors, which is a whole grab bag of different mental attitudes and various emotions and ways that we interact with the environment, different emotional reactions and attitudes that we have. And then consciousness, which is just the bare state of awareness of the 5 senses and the mental consciousness. So actually, of these 5 aggregates, one is the body, the other 4 all refer to various aspects of the mind. Okay? So I'm just saying this because when they talk about the dissolution process, you have the physical elements dissolving, you have the 5 aggregates dissolving, you have the 5 senses dissolving, you have 5 basic wisdoms dissolving. Okay? So I'll describe this process. So at first, the first step, and to correspond with all of these processes, there are external signs that somebody who's in the room can see what's happening to the dying person, but there are also internal signs that are perceptible only to the person who's dying. Okay? So these are very important, like if somebody's meditating, they can be aware of not only the external signs, but the internal signs, and be able to follow these and transform them. Okay, so at the first stage of these kind of 8 stages of death, what is dissolving is to start out with the earth element. And dissolving simply means that it's losing its force. It's losing its ability to support consciousness. So we have a whole process here of the body gradually being unable to support the consciousness. When we're alive, our body and our mind are interdependent. They relate to each other. The body's healthy, the mind gets along well. If the mind's healthy, the body tends to be better. They interrelate, they support each other. At the time of death, the body is losing its energy to be able to support the mind, so that we have this gradual separation process between body and mind occurring. So at first, when the earth element is dissolving, the body has a sensation of weight. Yeah, often people feel like they're sinking below the earth. They grab onto the bed around them. The body tends to get thin, and it loses its flesh. The earth element is lacking here. The aggregate of form is dissolving, the body, again, so the person's not relating so much to their body. The sense of sight is decreasing, so they can't see so much. Yeah, usually we're very, very involved. Our sight is maybe one of our principal senses. We're very involved with what we see. We relate to it a lot. But here the eyes are losing their power. We don't see. Things become dim. And similarly, the body itself loses its color. It loses its luster. Okay? And then the basic wisdom, what's called the mirror-like wisdom, the ability to reflect many different objects and apprehend many different things, is again decreasing, so the person can't relate to the environment so well. Okay? This is just at the beginning of the death process. Of course, these things, they grow gradually as the person's dying. And internally, at that point, because the earth element is losing its power, the water element becomes more evident. It's not that the water element is getting stronger, but it's just becoming more evident. So the person internally, remember I spoke about these internal visions they have. Internally they have the perception of like a mirage, of like there just being some kind of water shimmering in the distance. Yeah, mirage-like vision. Then at the second kind of stage, or the second dissolution stage, and like I said, these are not discretely marked. Here the water element is losing its power. So the body fluids tend to dry up. The person gets thirsty. They don't want to drink anymore. The circulation slows down. Okay, so all the whole fluidity of the body is drying up. The feeling aggregate is losing its ability. So people stop experiencing so much pain and pleasure related to their body. Imagine that, because we're so in tune with our body and our senses, the pain and pleasure is very important. Well, at this point, it doesn't become so important. People don't feel it so intensely. Because the fire element is dissolving, the wind element is becoming more evident and noticeable. So the person's internal vision is of like fireflies, the movement of fireflies, or like sparks in a fire. So there's some movement going on because the wind element is more noticeable. They always talk about sparks. Then in the fourth stage of death, the wind element is absorbing, is losing its power. So at this point, the breath, you find the changes in the breathing, the breath slows down, and eventually stops. Now this is interesting. I said there were 8 stages to the death process. The breath stops at the 4th one. So from a Buddhist view, when the breath stops, the person isn't dead yet. Okay? It's only the 4th stage. Yeah? So the breath stops. In terms of the aggregates, it's the aggregate of compositional factors. So all the conceptions, all the gross conceptions, the gross emotions, all these kind of stop at this time. Clearly somebody stopped breathing, they're not going to be angry and attached and, anymore. Gross ones.
Oh, okay.
Gross, could be subtle. But the gross ones have dissolved at this point. And then, of course, in terms of the senses, the taste, they stop tasting food, and they stop feeling tactile sensations. Okay. Now, of course, I think a little bit of tactile sensation might remain. A little bit of hearing might remain at this point. Yeah, but not very much. It's really losing its power because the body and mind are separating gradually here. In terms of the wisdom, the all-accomplishing wisdom is losing its force, and so people have absolutely no relationship to the outer world. They don't want to accomplish anything. Yeah, if you stop breathing and your emotions are kind of flat, clearly you're not into accomplishing very much at that point in a worldly way. Okay,
all right.
In a worldly way, the accomplishment has decreased. Because the breath has stopped, the wind element has stopped, there's simply the internal vision of a very, very dim light at the end of a tunnel. Very dim light, as if it's about to go out, which clearly life is. It's about to go out. Okay, then the 5th stage, what happens is the person has, what is dissolving at this stage is all of the rest of the conceptions. In terms of the subtle nervous system, the winds that support life, that are in the upper part of the body, begin to enter into, in our subtle nervous system, there's one channel that goes from the crown to the sexual organ. There's one central channel. Well, a lot of the winds begin to enter at the crown, and slowly a substance is released at the crown that starts to go down the central channel towards the heart. And the person gets an internal image of like vacuity, but with a white light. So it's called the white appearance. It's like just white light. And this comes because of this white substance. And it's a very subtle substance. I don't even know if you cut a person open if you'd find it. You know, we're talking about the subtle nervous system here that descends along the central channel at that point. Okay, that's the 5th stage. In the 6th stage, what dissolves is this white appearance. Okay, so the white appearance that was formed, that was prominent in the 5th stage, in the 6th stage it dissolves. And what's happening is the energies in the lower part of the body enter the central channel at the lower part of the body, and then they start to come up the central channel towards the heart. And as that happens, then the person has a very subtle appearance of like, they say it's like dawn, with the reddish sky at dawn. So it's a kind of reddish appearance. Again, there's this sense of vacuity in space, because, you know, all the very, very gross conceptions have stopped. But the mind's still slightly dualistic, because there's this perception of, at this point, this redness in the space, like the red sky before dawn. Then at the 7th stage, what dissolves is this red appearance. It ceases. And by that time, all the subtle energies in the body have been collected together at the heart. At the heart, what we've had since the time we were conceived in the mother's womb is what's called the indestructible drop. And this has some very subtle, extremely subtle energies in it. The extremely subtle consciousness is inside this indestructible drop. At the 7th stage, the upper energy, the lower energy have met at the indestructible drop and have surrounded it and have encased it. So there's the internal feeling of darkness. So the person has an internal vision of darkness. And then later on, it's as if they faint and lose consciousness altogether. And then after that, what arises is the 8th stage of the death process. And at this point, the energies have not just surrounded the indestructible drop at the heart chakra. So when I say heart, I'm talking about the heart chakra in the center of the chest, not about our physical heart. But the subtle energies have absorbed into that subtle drop, and the subtle drop is beginning to open and release. And so there is an internal vision of what's called clear light. And this is the final stage of death. This is when the person actually dies, with this internal image of complete vacuity, complete non-dualistic perception. We've gotten down not just the gross consciousnesses, our sense consciousnesses have absorbed, and not just the subtle consciousnesses of the white vision and the red vision and the black vision. Those have all absorbed. But we've actually accessed the extremely subtle mind at that point. And it's this extremely subtle consciousness that is changing moment by moment by moment. It's not a fixed thing. It's not a permanent soul. It's not a permanent essence or identity. It's changing moment by moment. But this extremely subtle consciousness is what leaves this body and then goes into the intermediate state and eventually into the next body, bearing with it what we say in Buddhist language, the karmic seeds, the imprints of the actions that the person has done in their preceding lives. It bears that with it. And that's the actual moment of death, when there's the dawning of that clear light. At that moment is when the consciousness actually leaves the body. So the breath has stopped long ago. Consciousness hasn't left yet. But this is kind of the thing that's going through in the Buddhist model of death. And so actually there's a whole meditation practice that goes with that to help somebody identify that clear light of death. The idea being that if you can identify the clear light of death, that subtle mind can then be used to generate the wisdom excuse me, it can be used to generate the wisdom that understands and directly perceives reality, which is a very important wisdom to generate, because with that wisdom then we can free ourselves from all of our ignorance, anger, and attachment.
I want to tell a story right now about a woman who had an incredibly healthy death, in my perspective, and exhibited some of the things that we've talked about, both from the spiritual standpoint and also from the physiological standpoint. And Alice was a woman who had lung cancer and had been treated with aggressive radiation. She was a woman in her 60s, early 60s, had 5 children, and I believe she had 14 grandchildren. And her physician called up the hospice program and said, Alice is not dying of her lung cancer, she's dying of the treatment of the lung cancer. The radiation on the tumor had destroyed the tumor but left a hole in her lung that continually filled up with bacteria. And for the last 2 years, she had been treated with many, many different kinds of antibiotics time and time again. And at this point in her life, the antibiotics were no longer effective. That all the IV antibiotics, all the oral antibiotics weren't touching the infection whatsoever. So Alice and her physician had decided this was the time for her to die. So they called in hospice. So I went to see her, and I was pretty apprehensive because knowing this about her, that meant a pretty ugly death. The kind of death that she was going to experience is very difficult. And so I went in to see her, and here was this lovely woman propped up in bed with a cup of tea and saying, "Hey, how are you?" Just extremely pleasant, extremely happy. And I said, this is very strange. This is not the kind of countenance you usually see with someone who has this kind of situation, because she'd only found out about the antibiotics failing, I think, on a Monday, and I think I came to see her on a Wednesday. So it wasn't very long for her to make this kind of transition. But anyway, we sat down to chat, and she said, now, I'm not at all worried about this death business. I worked this out. I'm a good Catholic. I know exactly where I'm going. I know what to expect. I'm not worried about that stuff. I'm worried about my kids. I want to know exactly what my death is going to look like, and I want to be able to tell my kids what it's going to look like, because I think it's going to be frightening. And my job as a mother has been to give them life, to launch them into life, and now my job is to teach them how to cope with my death and maybe learn how to die themselves. I mean, that took my breath away. Just took my breath away. To have someone with that kind of understanding says to me that she has done lots and lots of spiritual work. So my first inclination was, let's see if we can try more antibiotics, because I want her to live longer. I want to know more about this woman. But anyway, we sat down and I talked with her about what I thought was going to happen. And number one is that as that bacteria grew, she was going to become more and more feverish. She was going to start having symptoms of just an intense infection. She was going to become more and more short of breath. She was going to have more pain in her chest. She was going to be struggling to breathe. She would be spiking a pretty high temperature at the end. She actually, when she died, she was spiking a temperature of about 105. So she said, well, that sounds pretty disgusting, doesn't it? She said, am I going to smell? I said, yeah, you probably will smell quite bad. And she said, I'm going to be real sweaty and clammy, and my hands are going to feel pretty rotten, right? And I said, probably so. And she said, okay, we got some work to do here. And so we figured out what we needed to do was to call a meeting with Alice and myself and each one of her adult children separately. And so we set up a schedule. And so we had a meeting with each one of her children to discuss what her death would look like, what Alice wanted from each of them in terms of their support, and how she could best support them, which is very unusual. You usually don't run across someone who's dying saying, I want to support my family in this. So this was just an amazing process, and there was many, many tears from myself and everyone in the room. So by the time we went through this process in about a week, because we knew we didn't have a whole lot of time, that the bacteria was starting to grow. And at the same time, we started thinking about all these 14 grandchildren who ranged in age from like 6 months to 14 years. So we have a children's specialist at Hospice of Seattle. It's a program called Safe Crossings, and she has special training in working with kids. And she started working with these young children about their grandmother's death. And they would start doing artwork on what this woman had meant to them, and what did they learn from her. And I mean, they did these great posters with, she was the first one who introduced me to Twinkies, and these kinds of things that kids do. And so the kids would these children would bring in these posters to talk with her about it. And she would start then to tell the kids what she was going to look like as she got sicker. And so this started becoming just part of the texture of the family, that she kept pulling in all this physiology and telling everyone, down to the 3-year-old, up to the 14-year-old, everyone was talking about it, saying, well, Grandma's going to smell really rotten when she's nearly dead. I mean, this is the way the family was saying it. It was pretty extraordinary. So these kids were just in the room. They were crawling on the bed. They were holding her hand. The adult children were having more difficulty than the younger children, because they were probably experiencing it more on a deeper existential level. But the kids were just, this is happening to Grandma. And Grandma is telling us that this is safe. That was the thing that was so clear. She was making the process safe for everybody. As she was dying, as I said, she spiked a temperature of 105. Sweat was pouring off of her. She was cold and clammy. We'd started a morphine drip on her because the pain was so intense and the breathing was so intense. But no one would leave the room. This is probably the ugliest death I've ever seen. It was loud, the crackling, the gurgling, you could hear it throughout the house, but no one would leave the room. No one would leave this woman's side. The kids were crawling on the bed, holding Grandma's hand, even though they were cold and clammy and stinky. They were massaging her hands, they were massaging her feet. They wanted to be there. What this says to me is that this is possible, that this kind of death, surrounded by that kind of love, surrounded by the idea that this is a growing experience, this is an experience that is natural, that is part of life, that gives us an opportunity to connect with people, is there. And if you think about what spirituality may mean and why all of us are here, is to talk about the spiritual element of it. Spirituality is about strength and connections. And that's what this woman's death was all about. Her life had been about strength and connections, but also her death. That she encompassed that in her life, and she transferred that to the children in her family. And after a few weeks after the death, I went to visit the family again. And they were then talking about, in retrospect, how it really was pretty horrible to watch that. But they didn't notice that until several days afterwards. That they didn't sense the ugliness of it until it was over. That didn't register in their mind. While they were there, while they were in the midst of it, it was Grandma dying, it was Mom dying, it was my wife who was dying. And her spirit, her spiritual connection, transcended that for everybody in my mind.
This is a very different type of story. It's a Tibetan story. So the way Tibetans handle death is a little bit different than the way Americans do. And I was living in India at the time. And right below, I was living up the mountain a little bit, and right below where I was living, there was a row of like stone and mud huts where some monks were living. And these monks led pretty quiet lives and did their practice, and that was it. And one day, a nun came running up to where I was I was staying at a center where there were some Westerners, and said, "Oh no, the old monk has fallen. Come and help." So I was with another Tibetan nun and then a Western woman from Australia who was a nurse. So we went down, and sure enough, this old monk had fallen outside. So we picked him up and got him put back in his bed in his stone and mud hut. And we notified some of the other Westerners at the center. And we notified his Tibetan friends, the monks who lived nearby him. And there were completely different reactions. The Westerners said, "Oh no, he's dying." So they got in the Jeep, they ran down the mountain, in this incredible twisty, turny one-lane road, down the mountain in the Jeep, to go to the hospital, to get the doctor, to drag the doctor away, bring him up in the mountain in the Jeep, rush the doctor in there. And what does the doctor say? He's dying. It's like the Westerners knew that. Everybody knew he was dying. But it's like our Western reaction was, we can't let this person die. We can't. We have to do everything and create this whole scene and this whole stuff because we can't accept that this person's dying. Meanwhile, what had happened was when we told the Tibetan monks who were his neighbors, they said, "Oh." And they, they didn't freak out and flip out and run to get the doctor. They said, "Oh," and they knew what his principal meditation practice was. So we all got together in one of the neighboring rooms, and we sat down and we did what's called the self-initiation of this one particular meditation practice that he was doing, knowing that we were doing it, that he knew we were doing it, that he was doing the meditation also as he was dying. Okay. So the Tibetan monks, his friends, for years and years, sat there. We did our practice for about 5 hours. Everybody's calm, everybody's concentrated, doing their meditation. Then we finish and we go out, and then one of the monks goes in the room to check on this monk. And by that time he had stopped breathing. And there are certain signs they look for when somebody is dying. And to see kind of some prognosis about their future rebirth. And this monk came back out, and he came out with this incredible grin on his face, and he was really happy, and he reported all these good signs that he had seen. And I was thinking, this is incredible, I mean, if when I'm dying, everybody around me could be that calm and that supportive spiritually, and that happy, afterwards. I mean, wouldn't that be wonderful? Uh-huh. And so I thought, it's a different culture, a different society, but again, it shows this way of like how we can really support people instead of just letting all of our energy, both the dying and the surviving, draw in and spin around the self and its own fears and clingings.
So many of us aren't going to be in a position of supporting someone as they're dying. We are also all going to be in the position of being the person on the bed who is dying. And so we probably need to give some thought to what do we want. And there are some guidelines that we might want to look at. These, again, are not at all cast in concrete, and they really change from person to person, to family. And my role as a hospice nurse is to try to ferret out what are the family rules, what are the family preferences and things. But as a general rule, these are some of the kinds of things I like people to do when people are dying. And number one is to find a place for that person to be where they are protected from a lot of the day-to-day in and out of the house kinds of things. Like a lot of times people will put the hospital bed in the living room right in front of the front door, and so every single time that door opens, the draft hits them. You can really see that in the wintertime. That would be pretty lousy for someone who's dying. But also just that constant movement in and out of the house, that constant disruption. My guess is that as people are coming closer to the end of their life, they are in a natural meditative state. So if you have them in a place in the house that is constantly being disrupted by comings and goings, by telephones, by things like that, you may be interfering with that process, and it may not be the kindest thing. The other thing is that when I was working in the hospital, and someone was in a coma and was dying, what was routinely done is the nurse would come in and turn the television on so that there would be some noise. Okay? So who wants to die to the days of our lives? Or all my children? This is something that often is an unconscious part of family life, though. People have the television on day and night sometimes. But when you think about death as a spiritual process, that's kind of counterproductive. So you may want to turn the television off. The more important than the environmental issues is the environmental issues inside you. You know, what is the environment in your heart? What is the environment in your mind? If you're going to be sitting at someone's bedside as they're breathing out of their body, what is in your being? What sits here? Is it fear? Is it calmness? Is it dread? What is it? It doesn't make any difference what it is actually. What makes the difference is your mindfulness of it. Because one thing to remember is that fear and panic are the two most common mind states that arise in caregivers when someone is approaching death. So if you feel fear, if you feel panic, you are normal. The important part is having a sense of your mindfulness of it, of knowing when it arises, knowing what it feels like. So it's not by surprise that you're experiencing it, but it's part of the process. Is that mindfulness that you bring to your being when you're sitting with someone is the difference between causing agitation by your panic or bringing understanding to the experience. It's a subtle difference, but it's a huge difference. When I'm working with families, I often try to teach them what I call emptiness practice. And it probably is not the same emptiness practice that you talk about. But it's one where you try to empty the baggage that you have about death. And that may be just trying to feel it wash out your feet, to wash away from you, to let it evaporate in some way. But trying to empty out as much as you can about your preconceived ideas of what death has to be. Because we often come to a situation and saying, well, I heard Lee talk about this wonderful woman named Alice, and this is the kind of death that I want my mother to have.
And I'm going to make her have it whether she wants to or not.
So again, the emptiness practice is letting go of those preconceived of what has to happen. Because what will happen probably is going to be just as good as what Alice had, but it will be different. But you are going to have trouble, you are going to have a messy death if you try to presuppose what that has to be. I mean, I've run into so many family members who've called me up and they said that so-and-so is at stage 5 in the death process. I said, oh my God, what list is she reading this time? There's probably 10 or 15 different lists on that. So there is not a special way to do it. There's not a staging way to do it. There are not, I mean, even though Kubler-Ross has the 5 stages of dying, she has come public and said, I wish I never did that, that it's gotten to be too concrete. So again, trying to empty out your preconceived ideas of what has to happen, and then being willing to listen to just what arises. Because just as your life is arising, so is your death. The kinds of things that happen on your deathbed, the kinds of things that happen on your family member's deathbed are arising in just the same kinds of ways as the way their life did. Fear is not something that's new to us. However, we think about fear differently in the face of death because it is the complete unknown. That we do not know what happens when we close our eyes and stop breathing. I mean, what if they're right and there is a hell? You know, what if they really are right? These kinds of fears are not, I mean, they sound kind of funny when they come from someone sitting on a podium, but when you are in the position of being the person who's dying, they are extraordinarily real. I had one patient who was a Catholic priest and had been a priest for many, many, many years. During the process of his dying, his fear of death was so palpable that he couldn't sleep, he couldn't do anything. It was just this horrible, crushing fear of death. So even living a spiritual life of tremendous vows, of tremendous humility, tremendous motivation, did not change the fear of death. I do not know that there is an antidote to that. I don't know, maybe there is from a Buddhist perspective, but from a Western medicine standpoint, there is not a specific antidote to fear. What we tend to do in Western medicine is medicate it. Is that we give people benzodiazepines, we give them tranquilizers, we give them sedation, we give them morphine. We try not to feel it from them. So what we often do as a medical perspective is medicate the person who's experiencing the fear so we don't have to catch it. But I think that so often when I've worked with patients who are experiencing that fear, or caregivers who are experiencing the same kind of fear, is that if you bring it to the table and you say, yep, that's it, and you hold that fear in your hand gently and say, yes, it's here. It's like naming the elephant in the living room. It tends to normalize the fear in the sense that it's expected, it's all right, it's identified. It's not something that takes you by surprise as much. But also recognizing that fear has a beginning, middle, and end too.
What we're talking about here is letting go, and letting go of control. And I think this is a fantasy we have during our life, is that most of our life we think we're in control, don't we? We want to be in control. We do everything to be in control. We organize everything. We make lists. We, write up policies. We do everything to have control over everything so that it's nice and organized, so I know what's going to happen and I know what's going to expect, because I can't handle change and I can't handle the unknown. And so we want to control and organize everything. We can't even control our body. Yeah, we can't control our digestive system or our brain waves or our heartbeat. So much of our body is out of our control. Look at our minds. We have this whole plan about how we want things to be. Our life plan. I'm going to do this and do this and do this. I had a friend when I was in college, our first year of college, and he said to me, okay, I'm going to go through 4 years of college, then I'm going to do 4 years of medical school, then I'm going to do 4 years of residency, then I'm going to work as a doctor, and I think I'll get married at this point, and I'll have 3 kids. I was waiting for him to say 2.5 kids, but, I'll have my 3 kids, and then I'll grow old, and then I'll die, and then I can relax. So we, in our attempt to control and organize everything, to feel like we know what's going to happen, what life is going to bring us, we restrict ourselves a lot. And we form a lot of conceptions that cause ourselves and others a great deal of pain because we want things to be a certain way. And we want this in our life, we want things to be a certain way, and it's very difficult for us to adapt to change. Yeah? And when we die, we want things to be a certain way. We want our own death to be a certain way. People ask, well, how can I help somebody who's dying? And I think one of the best ways is just to help them in this way. Let them know they don't have to do it in any particular way. And if in their minds they're hanging on to something very strong, like a lot of people have not gotten the physical sides of their life together, they don't know who they're going to leave what money to, and they have all these possessions and they don't know what to do about it. And can you imagine you're lying there dying and you're thinking, well, my goodness, who am I going to give my collection of CDs to? Yeah, I didn't put that in my will, and what's going to happen to them? And I've heard stories of this, of people. There was one Tibetan in the community where I lived in India. He died telling his daughter where he had buried some gold when they fled Tibet. Now, can you imagine dying and your mind is stuck on that gold when you're dying? That's not what you need to be thinking about then. Okay? So I think in helping people die, one of the first things is help them get rid of everything. And similarly, when they're ready to, you can't force it, but encourage them to develop a generous heart because they don't need those things anymore. And to develop that sense of generosity is so good for their heart if they can just think I have all these things and now other people can use them. I'm happy to give them away. I'm happy to think of other people being delighted at receiving these things. And so in that way, it frees the person from their own attachment to their things, and it also enables them to create some good imprints and delight and generosity. From a Buddhist perspective, there's a number of meditation techniques that can be used to handle fear. But these things are not things that you can start doing at the time you're dying. Yeah. You have to practice them and know them and be familiar with them during the time of life, okay? Because we need really, really strong habits. We're very much creatures of habits, and if we don't have a strong habit and a certain perspective why we're alive, it's very unrealistic to think that our mind's going to switch and we're going to have a whole different perspective on things when we're dying. So a few of these meditations, one of them is what we call the taking and giving meditation. So in this particular meditation, you might start out thinking of a group of people or a person who is experiencing difficulty and really thinking about what it's like to have that problem, what it's like to have that pain or misery in your life. And then thinking how wonderful it would be if that person or that group of people, if they were free of that. And developing that compassion that's so strong that would say, if I could take that pain away from them so that they don't have to experience it, I would very happily do that. And I think that for those of you who are parents, you might have that feeling sometimes with your children. Now, when your children are sick, you feel, if I could be sick instead of them, I'd much rather have that happen. So that same feeling of, if I could take away somebody else's suffering, I would be happy to. And so generating that feeling. And then in this meditation, you imagine their suffering leaving them in the form of smoke and pollution. This is a very graphic meditation. So all this pollution and smoke comes out of them, all the nature of all their own suffering and cause of suffering. And we inhale it. Okay? So this is not according to what ego wants, but somehow before we've even started this meditation, we've decided that we have to transform our attitude because what ego wants is not healthy. Okay? So we happily inhale their suffering in the nature of smoke, but we don't just let it sit there. It isn't like we take their suffering on and now I'm sitting there coughing and choking because I inhaled all this smoke and, and now I'm going to get cancer. They have cancer and I have so much empathy for them that I take on their cancer and now I'm going to get cancer. Okay? Meditating like that, we don't need that. Okay? But we take on the suffering, and we don't just let it sit there, but we transform the suffering as we inhale it into like a lightning bolt. So it's very potent, very strong. And what this lightning bolt strikes at is this lump at our heart of our own tightness, our own self-preoccupation, this whole melodrama that we make up of how important our own life is, combined with all the anger we have at other people for messing it up and all the attachment we have for getting everything we want, all that lump in our heart that we feel, we take on others' suffering and it turns into this lightning bolt and it hits that and it explodes it. Okay? So what we've done is we've taken what others don't want, which is their suffering, taken it on, transformed it, and used it to demolish the cause of our own suffering, that self-preoccupation and ignorance that we imagine as a black lump at our heart. Okay? So we demolish that own lump at our own heart. So at that point, others' suffering doesn't exist with them anymore. Our own cause of suffering doesn't exist with us anymore. And there's this incredible feeling of open space in the heart, just completely dropping all of our concepts about ourselves, completely dropping all of it, and just staying in that open space. Okay, that's the taking part of the meditation. Now the giving part is within this incredible open space, this total freedom from all this me, I, my, and mine stuff. Within that incredible open space, then we generate love, which is the wish for others to be happy, and we imagine being able to transform our own body into like a wish-fulfilling body, and multiply it and transform it and send it out so that we become whoever anybody else needs. So, we might send out our own body in the form of friends or doctors or nurses or babysitters or, traffic police or whatever anybody else needs. We imagine that we're able to become that. And then we imagine taking our possessions and instead of cherishing them and clinging on to all my things and protecting them, we also imagine them becoming bigger and better and giving them away. And they become whatever anybody else needs. And we give that away and we imagine others receiving that, especially the group of people that we imagine who were experiencing the suffering to start with. So we've given our body, we've multiplied and transformed and given it, same with our possessions. Then we think of even our positive potential, what we call our good karma, our spiritual energy. We take and also give that away, multiply it, transform it, make it rich, make it vast, give it throughout the universe so that it becomes all the conducive conditions for others to practice the spiritual path, so that it becomes, teachers and teachings and supportive groups, and so that it even becomes the realizations itself. So we send out all these things, we imagine all the living beings gaining all the realizations of the path to enlightenment. Okay, so it's an incredible meditation because we're everything that we usually cling on to so tightly. Here we're developing a mind that just has so much joy in giving it away to others and imagining that they receive that. Imagine that they receive the benefit. Imagine that their lives are transformed. Okay, so it's a very, very powerful meditation. And sometimes people get put off by this meditation because they say, what happens if I'm doing the taking part and I get sick? I mean, this meditation might really work and I might get sick and experience suffering. And I don't want that. And then we see that's the self-preoccupation. That's the attitude that keeps us so bound. And so we get a real good close look at that. And what we can do is, instead of identifying with that attitude as who I am and what I need to protect myself, to be able to put that attitude out there and say, this is not my true nature. This is something that's contaminating my mind. This is something I've let in my mind and I've followed my whole life, but it's made me absolutely miserable and I don't want to do that anymore. So when I take on the suffering, if I get sick, I'm going to give that all to that self-cherishing attitude. I'm going to give it all to my selfish attitude. Let the selfish attitude get sick. Give that pain to the selfish attitude. Okay? So we're separating out the pure nature of our mind from that self-preoccupation that keeps us prisoner. Quite honest and direct, and he said, well, as soon as we are born, we are certain to die. And that's the reality in which we live in. And if we want another reality, then we have to get ourselves out of where we are right now. But as long as we're in this body, the reality is that as soon as we're conceived in our mother's womb, we are from that moment on heading towards death. And there's no way out. So what is it that's important for us in our lives? What makes a life meaningful? And so this reflection on death puts that question in front of us, and it gives us a lot of creative opportunity to really look at it. So when we think about it, we are going to die, and that's it. We're going to have to leave this whole little world we've constructed about ourselves. And our time of death is approaching. It's not getting further away, it's getting closer. And so what comes when we think like that is we begin to feel, well, I want to make my life meaningful. Because the whole thing is, when I die, I'm going to want to feel like my life was worth having lived. And that brings up the whole question about, well, what is it that comes with us at the time of death? And what is it that makes a life meaningful? And we're all going to have to answer this kind of question ourselves. But this body doesn't come with us. The body gets discarded when we die. Similarly, all the people that we love and care about don't come with us either. It's easy to say, well, money doesn't matter. Money stays behind. But people, it's much harder to let go of. We get quite involved and attached with people, and these things are quite deep. Okay? Same thing with our material possessions. They're not going to come with us. Now, we work very hard to get them, but I haven't heard of anybody on their deathbed who said, I should have worked harder. I should have made more money. I haven't heard anybody dying saying, I should have made more money.
I have.
Have
I've also seen someone die clutching their purse. So.
But none of that comes with us, and yet we worry so much about our material possessions too. And they represent so much our success in life. You know, I'm successful if I have a lot of money. I'm successful if I drive a certain kind of car. I'm successful if I live in a certain neighborhood. Okay? So a lot of our self-image is involved with all of this stuff, and yet none of it comes with us at the time we die. Okay? But we do need material possessions to stay alive, and we need our body while we're alive, and we need friends and relatives while we're alive. So the question becomes, given that these things are not the ultimate meaning of our life, how do we have healthy relationships with them now? Yeah? And this is a challenge for us, and this is something we need to think deeply about. And I think this is emphasizing to us the real value of love over attachment. Yeah? Because especially when we think of other people, we see, you know, if we're not going to always be together, being attached to them doesn't work. It just creates more suffering and problems. But if we can really open our heart and genuinely care about others, you know, with as few strings attached as possible, going towards no strings, it's a gradual process. Now, if we can do that, then it's going to be a lot better for everybody involved, and we'll really be able to be of some benefit. So this reflection on death really, you know, asks us to look at those things. And it also asks us to be aware of our own mortality in a day-to-day way. Because sometimes we get so flustered about, I have so many things to do. Yeah? Is there anybody here who does not feel that they don't have enough time? Yeah, we all feel, I don't have enough time. I have so many things to do. I have to do this and this, and my life is so busy, and my life is so rushed. You know? And we fill our mind with, I have to do all these things. The world's going to collapse if I don't do them. And yet, you know, life goes on with, you know, whether we're there or not. And we really don't have to do any of those things. And we could be in the middle of doing any one of them and die in the middle. I mean, there's lots of people who go out for a cup of coffee and don't come back home. They die in the middle. They go out to a movie, they don't see the end of it. Start a meal, don't finish it. Go on a vacation, never get there. You know, we're always in the middle of doing something when we die. Always. And so the time of our own death is totally unknown to us. But are we ready to die? You know, if we were to die today or tomorrow, are we ready to die? And if we aren't ready to die, when are we going to be ready to die? Okay, so what comes with us at the time of death is our habitual patterns, our habits, our tendencies, the imprints of the actions that we've done. And so that makes us look and ask ourselves, well, what have I done? And why do I do what I do? And what really are my motivations? And do I have an ethical life? And am I living out of a kind heart? You know, here's this word authentic again. Am I being authentic? Now, what's my motivation for the things that I'm doing? And so it makes us look at that. And I think that that's very healthy and very good for us to do. That we need to ask ourselves, why am I doing what I'm doing? You know, am I doing things out of anger, but posing to myself and to others that I'm doing them out of kindness? Am I having a kind heart, but I can't even let myself feel it, and so I feel guilty instead? Yeah? But really looking at what's going on in our mind and cleaning it up. And cleaning it up now, because again, we don't know how long we're going to have to live. And because while we're alive, we want to be happy, don't we? And so those very things that make us miserable at the time of death also make us miserable while we're alive.
when people are grieving, a couple of stories come to my mind that are so classic, and the one is about a woman whose husband died. They'd been married 47 years, and she said she did fine when she went to church, when she went, down the street walking around, but when she went to the grocery store, she completely broke down. And she particularly broke down when she had to buy peanut butter, because for 47 years she'd brought creamy peanut butter for her and crunchy peanut butter for him. And they always ran out of peanut butter at the same time, and so every time she had to go to the store, she was reminded in a way that wasn't intellectual. It was on this gut level, on this level that hits you, that you cannot conceptualize. Because grief is not something that you can just write into an objective comment and brush it aside. It's something that you live. Grief transforms. Grief changes. I think it's also important for us to look at all the parts of grief and to look at the depth of the kind of grief, but I think the important part, the part of the reason we're here, may be to look at how the transformation of grief occurs. And again, I'll tell a story. And this is a story of a family whose baby was born. This was the third baby. And just was not developing quite right. That was a perfectly happy baby, an angelic baby, but just didn't have the same kind of muscle tone. And just kept not developing. And so they went to doctors and they said, no, the baby is just fat. Just doesn't have enough strength. It's just a fat, chubby little healthy baby. Well, one day they took it to the doctor, and the doctor was doing an exam and looked in the eye and found a cherry red spot. And the doctor gasped, because he said in 30 years of medical practice he'd never seen that, but that means Tay-Sachs, which is the genetic fatal disease. Anyway, they did all the workup, and yes, indeed, this was a neurological genetic disease, which would mean this baby would die very, very young. The mother and the family went through the kind of grief that you would expect, the kind of just heart-wrenching, the tearing apart of the death of a child. But the thing that was amazing to me is that as this process unfolded, this woman entered the process with her child with such a depth, and she accepted her grief to such an extent that when her baby died, she said she felt that the baby had been reborn in her. And so that the transformation happened through the process of the grief. So that she said she always felt sad, she always felt that this baby was a loss, but he had been reborn inside of her somehow. So that it was the transformation. So the way I think that we can help people who are grieving may be to help model for them or give them support for entering their grief as deeply as they possibly can. To not trying to distract them, which is what we usually do. What we usually do is say, oh, let's get you away from the house, we'll go see a movie. We'll go see Ransom or Lethal Weapon or something like that, rock'em sock'em, and try to think of something completely different. Maybe what we need to do is sit with them and say, you tell me as much as you can about this. What is this inside you? I really want to hear you. I really want to hear what your grief is about. Tell me about it. Encouraging people to enter that negative space as deeply as you can may be the way we work with grief. Often I hear children talk about the spiritual path being a path of making friends with yourself. And this is extremely true in terms of the path of grief. It's a matter of trying to make friends with that part of yourself that is hurting that bad. Making friends with your part of yourself that is doing the if-onlys because your child killed herself. Harvard University did a research study a few years back trying to find out what the American public felt normal grief was. And they did a study on they asked people, if you lose a spouse, how long does it take for you to recover from the loss of a spouse? Surprisingly, the American public said it takes about 6 months to recover from a grief of that magnitude. So if that's the way the American public thinks about it, we're in big trouble, because that ain't the case. 2.5 years for the loss of a child is nothing. That is nothing. Grief takes an awful long time to recover from.
The other thing is to really sit and examine the thoughts. And this I find equally incredibly fascinating, the kind of thoughts that my mind is thinking when I'm grieving. Yeah. And part of it is telling the story, and there is a certain kind of incredible release when you can tell the story to somebody else, and when you can just say, remember this and remember that, and I feel this because this could have been blah, 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 you know? And it can be very relieving to say it to somebody. But at a certain point, I also have to recognize in my own mind that my mind is clinging on to something there. That I'm telling the story, but what I'm telling is not happening right now. That I'm telling a story of something that happened in the past. And whether the person is alive or whether the person's dead, that story in the past is not happening now, and it never will happen again, even if the person were still alive. It's not going to happen again. And I think also, sometimes what I look in my own mind is I grieve for what the future could have been. You know, it's like, well, this person never lived long enough, and we could have done this, and we could have had that experience, and this could have happened in their life, and it could have turned out that way. And yet, you know, all the could have beens, all the future things, when I sit down and I look and I just sit with it, they don't exist right now either. Yeah, all the things that could have been, all the things that never happened, aren't existing right now. And so it's incredible to watch how our mind gets stuck in the past, it gets stuck in the future. And it's so difficult just to be with what is happening right in this very moment and to see the beauty in this very moment. We always feel that our pain is so personal, our suffering is so personal. There's a story at the time of the Buddha of one woman who came with a dead baby in her arms, sobbing to the Buddha and saying, my child died. You know, I mean, if you can imagine your infant dying, the kind of grief that a mother would go through, and just sobbing, you know, can you make this baby come back to life? Please do something to make my child live again. And the Buddha said, first, you bring me some mustard seeds from a home where there's never been a death. Now, mustard seeds in ancient India are like rice or bread in an American household. Everybody has it. So this woman started knocking on the doors and, you know, asking, you know, do you have some mustard seeds? Well, yes, I do. Can I have them? Well, yes, of course. Oh, but first I have to ask you, has there ever been a death in your family? Oh, well, yes, of course. And as she went from door to door, each house had mustard seeds. Each house had also had a death. And at one point she recognized that her experience of loss and grief over this child was not her own personal experience. She wasn't the only one who had ever experienced that depth of pain and mental suffering. That this was a very general, generic human experience. And at that point she was able to go and bury her child. And some kind of acceptance of the situation came.
The biggest problem with suicide is the emotional blackmail that's attached to it. Is that usually people do not commit suicide because their relationships are strong and good and positive. Usually suicide comes from a point of despair and a lack of connection or a sense of having severed connections. So when someone does kill themselves, there's a sense that I didn't do enough. Actually, the reason I went into nursing was because a friend of mine committed suicide. That because of that experience, because of the death, because of how she killed herself, I was shattered. I was completely shattered. And my world came to a stop. That I'd been working as an insurance underwriter at that point, and I just quit. I could no longer go back and do that particular kind of work. So I have a lot of empathy for the kind of shattering that suicide can do. What happened for me was when I came through the grief on the other side, I said I have to look at my priorities and my world differently, and then I went back to nursing school and ended up in hospice and all that. And so the process of my finding my priorities was part of the healing. And the biggest problem with suicide in my mind is the sense of, if only I had done this, if only I had done that. And when I talk to people who've lost friends or relatives that way, that's what I hear, this if only. But the if onlys lack humanity. The if only statements lack that human sense of that we have failings, we have limitations, we have a part of us that is never going to be enough. Some situations can never get enough love. So it's real tough. Suicide has got to be the stickiest of any death in my mind. It's got to be the absolutely stickiest. It's like you're walking through mayonnaise. It never gets off you. You're always left with some kind of a residue with it. It's very, very difficult.
Slug slime.
Slug slime, yeah. What we ended up doing with this friend of mine who killed herself is we ended up going up to Orcas Island and having a special service, and spent an afternoon doing forgiveness meditation, and did a lot of talking and thinking about the hungry ghosts, which is in the Tibetan tradition, which is a ghost with really, really tiny neck and big, big belly. And the neck is too small to let anything in. But they're constantly ravenous, they're constantly hungry. And so we thought about Karen from that perspective, is that she had been so hungry for life, but she wouldn't let the love in. And somehow that symbol helped us work through it somewhat. But it's very, very difficult. And I don't know that that kind of pain goes away. I don't think it goes away completely. It can be processed, it can be handled. But even after all these years with me, I can still remember the grief with Karen. What medical and nursing professionals have been taught to do is to protect themselves by exuding professional warmth, but don't getting involved, okay? And people will say, how can you work in hospice? Isn't that depressing? You're going to burn out. And they'll see my practice and they'll say, you'll never make it. You're never going to be able to survive. And so what they encourage medical people to do is to make sure that you always separate yourself. You always send a little bit of separation between who you are and who's dying. One of the ways they do that in nursing school anyway is they say, never forget who's the patient. Never forget who's the patient. Don't think that you're the patient. Don't think you're the one that's dying. My sense is that boundaries are good, and I think we do need to have a certain amount of boundaries, but in the other sense, we don't need to close off our heart and make us numb. There's part of us that doesn't want to risk being hurt, and so that's part of this wanting the wall, wanting the boundaries. And when I think about my own practice, I have to ask myself, what have I got a heart for if it's not there to be broken? That I need to really let my heart be broken on a lot of different levels, and if I hurt, fine.
People come to things at their own pace. And I've had a number of people say to me too, you know, my heart feels numb or my heart feels cold. But I think sometimes it's just, I think the fact that they're aware of that already shows that there's some feeling and some involvement in it. It's the people who aren't even aware that their heart's numb. Those are the people I worry about. How do we see physician-assisted suicides? Well, from a Buddhist viewpoint, killing is killing. It's very clear. And of course, there's different degrees of killing, different motivations for killing. But taking life is nonetheless taking life. And so from a Buddhist viewpoint, this kind of thing would not be beneficial for the physician, and it wouldn't be beneficial for the person who was dying either. Because we say that life is something very precious, especially a human life. But I remember asking my teacher one time, we were talking about euthanizing animals. And is it good to do? And my teacher said, well, if you know exactly where your pet's going to be reborn, and you know that they'll be in less suffering, then okay. And our thing was, we don't know. Well, that's part of it, we don't know. Okay? And so it seems like, as far as I'm concerned, it would be much wiser to talk to somebody about how they can make their life meaningful rather than how they can die. Because if you can make your life meaningful, then even if you're in pain or even if your body doesn't work so well, your mind can be very happy and joyous.
I have talked to hundreds of patients that have asked me about assisted suicide. They've asked me, what medications do I need to hoard? How much morphine do I need to take? What is the lethal dose? But I know of only one patient who actually did it. And in many ways, I think it's an issue of control, and that's something that we talk a lot about, is that suicide gives us control over the manner of our death and the time of our death, and also to a certain degree over the suffering associated with our death. But the issue that's central to that is the whole issue of suffering. It's not pain, because pain we do pretty well with. We don't control all pain. I mean, some researchers will tell you that all pain is controllable, and I say garbage. There is some pain that cannot be controlled. As a medical profession, as a group of community people, as anyone who's interested in assisted suicide, I think we have to address the issue of what is suffering, and what can we do to relieve suffering. Part of the reason I think that people don't commit suicide as much as it appears that people want to is that if you give them the room to talk about it, if you give them the room to tell you why, it does bring it out, lays it on the table, and all of a sudden they're able to identify their meaning. They're able to look at the search for meaning. They're able to connect. They're able to make that kind of a touch point, not only with their heart, but with the heart of other people who are willing to talk about it. And so then there isn't the need. Then they're willing to let nature take its course. But in the same sense, I know there's diseases that need suicide. There's certain diseases that are so horrible that we ought to be able to do that. I think of people that, say, have head and neck cancer that are forced with either bleeding to death or choking or suffocating. I don't know if the compassionate thing is to say, well, you're going to have to just suffocate and suffer through it. I don't know that that's the kindest thing. I think we need to, again, look at our motivation. Is the idea behind assisted suicide truly compassion? Is it the relief of suffering? Or are we just not working with suffering very well? When you are at the bedside, if you are going to bring compassion to that bedside, you better know your motivation. You better know what the point of being there. Is it to bring love to the room, or is it to bring your agenda? Is it to bring Buddhism, or is it to bring authenticity? That the important part of the spiritual practice is always the authenticity of the person who's doing the dying and the person who's doing the caregiving. The authenticity is far more important than the dogma. It will always win out over dogma. So even though we talk a lot about trying to help people ventilate and try to reframe and to work with forgiveness and revenge issues and all these kinds of things, the motivation has to clearly come from wanting benefit, and wanting benefit for somebody else, not wanting benefit for us. That so much of our culture is geared to the whole idea of doing it our way, is winning the argument. And I've seen a lot of arguments just transfer from over the kitchen table to the deathbed. So again, the real important part of the whole process of bringing compassion to living and dying is knowing your motivation and setting your motivation as high as you can for the benefit of others. And
then let's dedicate all positive energy, that we've created as individuals and as a whole group of people. And let's rejoice at that positive energy we created today, and then send it out, dedicate it, spread it throughout the universe, imagining that as we do so, it alleviates the suffering of all living beings.